Hi guys, and welcome to this video. Today we're going to be looking at how to manage our time effectively. Now, if we don't manage our time well, it can often leave us feeling overwhelmed and that we have too many things on our plate. Luckily, there's some proven strategies that can help us to free our time and increase our productivity. My name is Alex and I'm a registered architect in UK. And today I'm going to be sharing 6 of my favorite time management strategies that will hopefully help you to become more productive. Make sure you stick till the end of this video for some additional productivity tips. So let's jump right into it. The tip number 1 is always make a to-do list. Now, this one may seem like a pretty obvious tip. However, there is a difference between effective to-do list and not so effective to-do list. And the difference is that effective to-do list is very brief and it only has the most critical things that we need to do for a day. If the to-do list is too long with many difficult or challenging tasks, it can feel overwhelming and we are less likely to act on it because the thought of just getting and looking at that to-do list is scary in itself. So we need to make sure that our to-do list is our friend rather than a scary monster that we don't want to look at. So how do we get to a nice and simple to-do list? Well, first of all, I would recommend to do what's called a brain dump, which is basically sitting down and writing everything that's on your mind that you think you need to do. And once the list is composed, it helps to go through and rank things in terms of urgency, importance, and effort. Tasks that are urgent, important, and require the least amount of energy should be done first. On the other hand, tasks that are urgent but unimportant are typically trivial and they should be crossed off the list. Another thing to note is that to-do lists should be made on daily, weekly, monthly, and even yearly basis. The reason for that is that we want to plan ahead and see what our priorities are well in advance. If we try to cram everything on a to-do list in a single day, those to-do lists are typically crammed with stuff and it's difficult to find what our priorities really are. Daily to-do lists should ideally be done a day before because that way it takes the least amount of energy and mental effort the following days to start and actually doing things that are on your to-do list. Another thing to note is that ideally each of the to-do lists should have one, maximum of 2 priorities that are absolutely critical to be accomplished on that specific day. The total number of the items on to-do list should not be more than 3 to 5 things, because if not, then there is a risk that the to-do list will be anxiety inducing. Another helpful principle to remember is that if a task takes 2 minutes or less to accomplish, it should be done immediately. So the next principle is called Pareto law, and this is really the most important and overarching principle which you can use when it comes to productivity. If you take anything from this video, this should be it. So Pareto law, or 80-20 principle, states that 20% of actions result in 80% of results. In other words, it's only a handful of actions that really matter for majority of output. The ratio itself can be skewed to 70-30, 90-10, 95-5, and so on. So an example of this can be in your house, for instance. When you look at the most worn areas on the floor, for example, it will generally be only 20% of surface areas in corridors and where you walk the most. Those will be the areas that are worn the most. And similarly in finance, for example, only a handful of people possess the majority of wealth. So when it comes to time management, this law really tells us that we should focus our attention on the high leverage, high impact stuff first before doing anything else. And so if the answer is not obvious straight away, then it helps to ask several questions. For example, which one of these tasks, if done correctly, will make all others irrelevant or unimportant? So you want to find one thing that will potentially have an impact on all other things. The other question might be, which one of these things is the most uncomfortable or difficult to face? Another thing to keep in mind is that there's an obvious question of, well, I have 5 important things to do and I need to do them all in a certain time frame and there's just not enough time to do all of them. So for example, if you have a variety of priorities, it's worth asking, which one of these I can let slide? Because let's be honest, if you have a variety of conflicting priorities, you will have to pick. And so it's worth cultivating this ability of being comfortable with letting small things happen. If you have a banal deadline with your boss or colleagues, it's worth either speaking to them directly or letting those assignments slip. And that's one of the most uncomfortable skills, but one of the most useful ones as well. Parkinson's Law is the next critical principle when it comes to productivity. So this law states that the work expands to fill the time available for its completion. For example, the same task can be completed twice as fast if we set aggressive deadlines. Now, this approach is obviously sometimes unrealistic, especially if the task is novel or it requires a lot of creative input. But generally speaking, it's possible. An example of this can be observed if we have an imminent deadline. We somehow manage to produce a lot of work in a very short period of time to meet that deadline. I think this is because our brain has this ability to magically figure out the most efficient way to do something when faced with a deadline. So setting the tight deadlines is really about training ourselves to get things done just right rather than focusing on making absolutely everything done to the highest possible standard. Energy management is another important principle to understand when it comes to productivity. Because everybody's energy levels fluctuate during the day, it's important to understand when you can be most productive and when you're least productive, so that you can focus on the most important things when you have the most energy to do them. So generally for most of us, energy levels rise up in the morning time until peaking at about noon, and then they gradually drop to the lowest point at 3 p.m. until after which they gradually rise again to meet a second peak at 6 p.m. and then they gradually fall down. So personally, I find that analytical tasks are better performed in the morning time when I have more alertness, and then more creative tasks are generally better performed in the afternoon when my mind is a bit more relaxed. Another way to think about time management, especially if you're in creative type of industry, is to think about the time in two categories: maker's time and manager's time. So Paul Graham has a good blog about this written ages ago that basically says that manager's time is really to do with all the meetings, phone calls, conversations, and other managerial tasks, whereas maker's schedule is really about a creative type of work that can only be performed well in a relatively long chunks of time, generally between 4 hours and half a day. So distractions in this time frame is really detrimental to your focus and the flow state, because the creative type of work requires a certain state of mind, a certain flow state that is difficult to get back if we keep getting distracted. So the next principle is the art of saying no. And it's really connected to all other previous principles that we have covered. In a way, saying no is 80-20 principle, but flipped on its head. It's rather than putting things that are important on our list, we're actually blocking out things that are distracting to us. And the most common culprits these days is really the social media and emails. So this means if we're constantly getting distracted with emails, with somebody else's priorities, we tend to lose our own. So recommendation when it comes to email management is really about trying to reduce the number of times a day you check the emails, ideally 4 to 2 times a day maximum. That way we have enough blocks of time in between checking emails to actually do productive work. And the same principle applies to social media, where if it helps, we can put our phone away from the room we're working in and blocking the notifications. Also, if checking news sites on the browser becomes a problem, then plugins like Cold Turkey, for example, can help with blocking certain periods of time. So again, to help us get into mode of focusing on important things. By the way, hit that like button below to let me know if you have enjoyed this video so far. So before getting into productivity tips, let's have a look at the last principle, and that is setting a direction. So this point is really not talked about that much in other productivity videos and blogs, and that is managing our time around the right kind of things, because we can become really advanced in productivity and time management quite quickly, but it doesn't help us if we optimize those things around the wrong kind of objectives. So managing time around wrong kind of objectives is actually worse than not having a good management system at all, but when you're heading towards the right kind of things. So the classic example of time misallocation is, for example, somebody going to a medical or a law school, spending all that time there only to realize that that's not really what they wanted. And in those kind of cases, even if the time is managed well relative to those goals, if the goals are wrong, then no matter how well we optimize, that time is inevitably wasted. Now, that's not to say that the skills one would acquire in a law or medical school are not transferable. In fact, they're really useful. But the point is, some of that time should have been used on something that that person actually wanted to. So the lesson here, I suppose, is really about cultivating a type of self-awareness that would allow you to pick things that are closer to your heart rather than picking completely wrong things. And one source that helped me in this this is Scott Adams' blog post that is about systems thinking and how picking projects is really about transferable skills and contacts that even in the event of perceived failure by the outside world would still leave you with some kind of gain. So it's worthwhile reading that and trying to cultivate the self-awareness skill. So last but not least is some of the actionable tips that hopefully will make implementing the principles that we covered so far a bit easier. So the first tip comes from Peter Drucker's famous saying, which is what can be measured can be managed. And the same thing applies most directly to time management. So getting into habit of recording where the time goes is one of the most useful things anyone can do to then start to optimize the time. And this can be done quite easily using Google Calendar or simply a notebook. And the goal here is really to see what amount of time that we use we're happy with and what can be improved. And the best way to go about it is to do it for a week in 15-minute increments and then to be able to see how the time is used over a week. So the next tip is about cultivating skills of getting the projects to just right rather than trying to be perfectionistic about it. And I'm struggling with this myself at times. And the problem with this is that it takes a lot of time to get something from the stage where it's good to perfect. It's usually, according to 80-20 principle, doesn't take that much time to get something in a rough shape and then adjust it to get it to a good level. However, it takes an extraordinary amount of time typically to get something from say 80-90% up to like 100. Cultivating ability of making things just right, just to the specification required, is really invaluable when it comes to time management. Batching is a way of putting tasks that are similar in the same period of time so that we can do them almost like in a factory, one after another. An example of this might be a research for an essay for a university student, for example. Instead of trying to research 3 different topics in different times, a person might go to a library and start researching all of them at the same time, therefore minimizing the time it requires to switch between the research of one paper and another. And the same principle can be applied, for example, in blogging, where it might take the same amount of time, maybe about 10% more, to finish 3 blogs at the same time rather than doing them one by one. It definitely takes a lot less energy to focus on similar tasks rather than spreading them and doing them separately over a longer period of time. So these are my favorite time management strategies. If you found them useful, please hit that like button below. I will be releasing more videos in upcoming weeks, so make sure to subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next video.